right. What is it? Oh, kids. Release the kids. Kids are released. 1 second, let me get this. It's going to my pocket. Okay. All right. So the last 6 weeks, Pastor Ed has taken us through how to renew our minds. How to renew our minds, how to guard our minds. He referred to this as guarding like soldiers on patrol, and to know the weapons of our warfare. And he said the more that our minds are renewed, the greater our ability to be used of God. He used a very Ed analogy about playing football as a kid and how he never wanted to ride the bench. He yelled it, I won't yell it. But he said, as a Christian now and in this church, he doesn't want to ride the bench in church either, and we shouldn't. He said we're called to be active, to do something for the manifold grace of God, and that by the renewing of our mind, we can start to think like Jesus. So now that we have renewed our mind and are thinking like Jesus, we need to learn to fight like Jesus. So that's what we're going to go through. We're going to learn how to fight like Jesus. And I'm going to do the memory verse a little bit later, but I do want to ask, he had challenged with the renewing of our mind. Did anybody memorize Philippians 4:8? Little extra credit memory verse? That's okay. It was the filter to run things through. Think on these things, brothers, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy, to think on these things. Okay, so now that we've gone through 6 weeks of renewing our mind, let's talk about how Jesus fought. And you might think that's an oxymoron, but it is not. Jesus was a fighter. Jesus was not passive, and Jesus was not a pacifist. And so we're going to start with, if you'll put up Matthew 11:29. And we're going to look at the word meek. Jesus was described as meek. Lowly, meek, and mild, I think, he's often described as. I think that's a lyric out of a Christmas song. And I think meek is one of the words that we just get this word wrong, because it sounds like weak. And meek is absolutely not weak. So, are we up there? There we go. All right. Matthew 11:29 says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest for your souls." And then 2 Corinthians 10:1, this says, "Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you." So, again, Christ is described as meek. Meek, so the Greek word for meek it's called praeus, and it's actually, so if you think of like, when we look at the Greek words and the Hebrew words, they're kind of picture words. They're meant to put a picture in your mind. And as we're going through this, and as I'm describing some of the events today, and we're going through Scripture, I want you to try and imagine what some of this looked like. I want you to really, really try and flex your imagination. Like, okay, what was the scene? Who was there? How would this have actually looked if you were there watching this? So, meek is actually a word used to describe a war horse, which is not what you would think of with weak. So the Greek armies would find the wildest horses, and they would bring them in and they would tame them. And after months of training, they would then separate them into categories. You would have some horses that were of no use or condemned. Side note, whenever you read or hear that verse, there's no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. I like you to think of that like condemnation is a building term. So a condemned building is of no use. So if you are in Christ Jesus, you are guaranteed to be of use. You are useful, purposeful, and meaningful. So anyway, so we have these horses where you have of no use, you have condemned horses, you have horses that are for ordinary duty, and then now we also have war horses. So these war horses were considered meek. And the war horses, they retained their fierce spirit, courage, and power, but were disciplined to respond to the slightest nudge or pressure of the rider's leg. They could carry 10 times the weight of what a non-broken horse could carry. They could ride into battle at 35 miles an hour and come to a sliding stop at just a word. They were not frightened by arrows, spears, or torches. To be meek was to be taken from a state of wild rebellion and made completely loyal and dependent on one's master. They were unflinching in the presence of danger. They were submissive but not spineless. They embodied power under control. To be meek is to give the reins over to God. So meek is power under control. Even Aristotle referred to a meek person as someone who was concerned about justice, but whose anger does not degrade into revenge or retaliation. A meek person is the one who feels anger on the right grounds against the right person in the right manner at the right moment for the right amount of time. Notice he never said a meek person never gets angry. So now that we know that Jesus was strength under control, not weakness, he was meekness, what does this look like? And we're going to go to Matthew 5, 38 and 39 here. So if you'll put that up. You have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Okay, so this is another one of those that is often taken as like if somebody slaps you, you turn the other cheek. Be a doormat. That is not what Jesus is saying here. This is, if we would have been there at this time, this would have had a totally different meaning because the culture and the traditions around there. So, Bo, come up here for me real quick. All right, so this is referring to a backhanded slap, and this is something that would have been done for the person slapping would not have expected any resistance. This would be like a soldier to a civilian or a Roman to a Jew. And, okay, so what he says is if someone slaps your cheek, give him the right cheek. So what you would have to do is if you were going to slap my left cheek, right? So in this culture, his left hand, he cannot use his left hand. Left hand is unclean. This is not allowed to be used. So he would have had to use his right hand. So if he would have slapped my right cheek, the only thing he could have done was use his backhand because the forehand would be for an equal, and I'm not an equal. And so by getting slapped on the right cheek and giving the other, I am now forcing him to make a decision. He either has to do something that is unclean or he has to look at me like an equal. So he would have to take his open hand or a punch. And so what Jesus was doing here is he was saying, thank you. You don't have to slap. I like that visual. But anyway, so what Jesus is doing here is he is actively defying, right? He is saying, he's not just laying down. He's saying, I'm not going to retaliate with violence, but I'm going to force you to treat me as an equal. I'm going to highlight the injustice of this. All right? A good example of this in the modern day would be, I believe this would be Rosa Parks. So, quick history lesson on Rosa Parks. 1955, Alabama. Well, we have segregation, black people and white people. You know, we had different water fountains, different restrooms. On the buses, you actually had two doors. I found this out. I thought this was interesting. You would have two doors. You'd have a front door and a back door. And a white person could go through the front door, and they would pay, and they would sit down in one of the front seats. A black person would have to go in, pay. They would come out the front door, and they'd have to go to the back door, then sit on the back or like the middle back section. And during this time, if all of the white section filled up and another white person got on the bus, then the driver had the authority to ask one of the black people to get up, and they actually asked the whole row to get up and move a seat for the white person. And one of the cruelest drivers, what they would do sometimes is if a black person got on through the front door and paid and then walked out, sometimes they would drive off. It just so happens that the day of this incident was the driver that had done this to Rosa Parks in the past. So when she comes on, she pays, she does get on the bus, she sits down, and a white person comes on, the white section's full, and the driver says, you need to move. She says one word, no. A meek lady changed everything. You know, with no, she says, I'm an image bearer of God, creator of the universe, and what you're doing is an injustice. And so this changes history. And so I just thought this was a really good example of what turning the other cheek really looks like. So is Jesus telling us to actively oppose and resist evil and injustice? We're going to find out. All right. If you'll go to Matthew 16, 13 to 20. So this is taking in place in Caesarea Philippi. Now, Jesus didn't do anything unintentionally. Nothing was accidental. Everything was by purpose. And that also includes the location. So Caesarea Philippi it sets about 25 miles up a mountain outside of kind of the surrounding areas of the Sea of Galilee. So he would have taken his disciples up this mountain. And one thing I want you to picture with the disciples, this is something we get very wrong, pictures, books, like drawings and stuff and movies. The disciples were not old, grizzled men. They didn't look like me. They didn't look like Robert Jackson. They looked like they were 13 to roughly like 20, 25-year-olds. These were young kids. This is who Jesus Christ picked to change the world. So here's his group of teenagers that he is bringing up, and they're going to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was the epitome of evil, and they all knew that. This place was depraved. This was just a center of pagan worship. They worshiped the god Pan. This was a half-goat, half-man god. They worshipped the nymph goddesses. So these are the goddesses of fertility. They had a worship center for Zeus. And this would include things like child sacrifice, bestiality. At the center of this place, they actually called this place the Rock of Gods because it was on a rocky mountain. And at the center of Caesarea Philippi is a giant, well, you can look at a picture of this. It's a big, creepy-looking cave with a river flowing out of it. This cave is actually called the Gates of Hell. So Jesus is taking his disciples to the gates of hell. And the way the gates of hell work, so what they believed was that the gods actually, this is kind of like West people who vacation in Florida for the winters. They believed that the gods were out in the summer, and then for the winter they would go back to where they were, the gates of hell. And so the gods would go through here. The sacrifices, what they would do is they would take whatever the sacrifice was, be it children, throw them in the gates of hell, and the thought was that if blood ran out of the water, that the gods have denied the sacrifice, and so they needed to go again until that wasn't like that anymore. So I just wanted to paint the picture of this, basically the worst of the worst. And so that's where Jesus is having this conversation. So if we'll look at Matthew 16, 13 to 20, we've got, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So here, he's talking about, this is why he's bringing up the gates of hell. One of the things I want to talk, so he says, "You are Peter." So Peter is the rock. Peter, in Greek, this is Petros. Petros is actually like a loose rock, more like a pebble. But on this rock, Petra, so we use rock for both, but Petra is actually it would be like a cornerstone. It's a foundational piece. This would, he uses a lot of building references because Jesus would have been, we call him a carpenter, but he would have been more like a stonemason. And so Jesus is, I think this is kind of a layered meaning here. So what he's saying is, Jesus, he is the rock. He is the cornerstone, because he talks about that. Jesus is the cornerstone that the builders refused. So Jesus is the rock, but this is also referring to the rock of the gods, where the conversation is taking place. And what he's saying is, we are going to build our church in the heart of darkness, in the presence of evil. This is a charge. He is presenting a clear challenge with his words. He is saying he doesn't want his followers hiding from evil. He wants them to storm the gates of hell. So Jesus is calling us to actively oppose evil. You don't have this one, but I'm going to read Luke 12, 15, 21. All right, so this is Jesus warning about coming division. Sorry, Luke 12, 49 to 51. So he says, "I have come to set the world on fire, and I wish it were already burning. I have a terrible baptism of suffering ahead of me, and I'm under a heavy burden until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to bring peace on earth? No, I have come to divide people against each other." All right. So again, this is Jesus telling us that he's not coming to make everything cool, everything good. He's coming to give us a charge. He's coming to challenge us. He's coming to tell us to oppose evil. When he says divide, so this conversation, this falls within it's a larger discourse that stresses the readiness for his return. This is when he's talking about, always being ready for when the Messiah is going to return and when the kingdom of heaven is near. So he says, the kingdom's arrival does not guarantee social tranquility. Instead, his presence forces a crisis of decision that fractures even the most intimate relationships. So this captures the inevitable clash between the values of the kingdom and the values of the world. So there's a lot of evil in this world. And the question I would have after this is, where would you even start? All right. So we're going to go to John 2, 13 to 17. This is a story that everybody's heard. This is Jesus clearing the temple. So I'm going to use John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is in all four of the Gospels. There's some debate, but I believe that he actually clears the temple twice. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referring to the second temple clearing. This is at the end of his ministry. John is talking about the clearing at the beginning of his ministry. So when he's clearing the temple, actually, you know what? I'm going to read this, and I'm going to read this one. I'm going to read this out of the Message. I know it's going to be up there on the New King James, but I like the wording of this one a little bit. So when the Passover feast celebrated each spring by the Jews was about to take place, Jesus traveled up to Jerusalem. He found the temple teeming with people selling cattle and sheep and doves. The loan sharks were also there in full strength. That's why I love that he calls them loan sharks. Jesus then put together a whip out of strips of leather and chased them out of the temple, stampeding the sheep and the cattle, upending the tables of the loan sharks, spilling coins left and right. He told the dove merchants, "Get your things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a shopping mall." That's when his disciples remembered the scriptures. Zeal for your house will consume me. Zeal is, all right, read the definition here for you. So zeal is focused desire characterized by passion and commitment. That's another word that we don't use very often, but it's good to know what zeal actually means. So what's going on here? Jesus is angry. Jesus is getting physical. But it's not just because people are selling there. If you go, we're not going to go to the scripture, but Deuteronomy 14 talks about this. God actually sets up a provision. And so first thing, Jerusalem, he says he goes up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city on a hill. Jerusalem is meant to be a light to the world. The Jews were chosen to be the example of the rest of the world. And they were chosen so that we would look up and see God's law and his relationship with his people, and that we would in turn want to have that relationship with him. So this is, and at Passover, you're talking probably 1 million people filling this place, coming to worship God. Now, the selling was okay, right? This is something that I was always confused about. I thought Jesus would have walked in and been shocked that they were doing these things, but he really wasn't. Because in Deuteronomy 14, God sets up this provision that, you would come and you would sacrifice an offering, and the offering would change based on kind of what your sin is. And so that's why you have sheep, oxen, doves. Big sinners get oxen, lesser sinners get doves. And if you were traveling from 40, 50 miles away and your sacrifice was an oxen, that's tough. Like you're not going to be able to bring an oxen with you to Jerusalem. So God says, don't worry about it. You sell your oxen, get your cash. This would have been Roman cash. You bring it to the Jewish temple. We're going to have money exchangers. That's okay, because we use temple money. You're going to exchange your money for temple money, and you're going to buy one of our oxen so you can sacrifice. So now you don't have to worry about lugging a big old oxen from wherever you are to Jerusalem. But what they were doing here, they had taken this and they had corrupted it. They had gotten greedy. So the money exchangers were taking a little bit. They weren't doing it a fair ratio. If it was supposed to be 1-to-1, they might have been taking 2-to-1. Like, okay, well, you give us 2 of your dollars to 1 of our dollars if you want to buy one of these oxen or one of these sheep. The other thing they were doing, they had the temple sacrifice inspectors. These are the guys, your sacrifice had to be clean. It had to be without spot or blemish. And they would come around and they would look at the thing and they'd say, "Ooh, I don't know about that one. you're going to need one of our sheep instead. So they're getting greedy with that. And Jesus sees, it's kind of like going to a concert or something. The $1.99 bottle of water that you get at Sheetz, you can't have that in the concert or in the movie theater. You have to go buy their $9.99 bottle of water. And that's greed. That's corruption. So that's what was going on here. You weren't allowed to have your thing. You had to buy their expensive thing. So this is what Jesus saw. And it also was taking place, the way the temple's set up, I won't go too far into this, but this was in the court of the Gentiles. So this is where we are Gentiles, by the way. We are everybody who was not a Jew was the Gentile. And so these were the people that were coming to worship God. They were supposed to be looking up to the Jews and to these people. And they were doing all this in the court of the Gentiles and really denying these people the place to worship and experience a correct relationship with God. And that got Jesus ticked. That made Jesus very mad. So the other thing, I used to always picture this as Jesus walks in and he's like freaks out and he sees this and he overturns the tables. So you got this guy who's normally meek, normally mild, which I thought at the time was weak, but now we know is not. And finally he just had enough and he comes in and he just loses it and overturns everything. That's not what happens. It says Jesus forms a whip of cords. Okay, so I want you to picture this. Jesus walks in, he sees all this, and in a calculated move, he says, okay, I'm going to be back, and I'm going to go make a whip, and then I'm going to come back. And has anybody ever seen The Sandlot? All right, somebody's seen The Sandlot. If anybody, just quick overview. There we go, Dalton's seen The Sandlot. Quick overview of The Sandlot. At the end, Benny the Jet Rodriguez has to go hop this fence, and the dog is known as the Beast, and he has to take this signed Babe Ruth baseball that was caught, that was hit over the thing, and it's this big event, and what he does before, he gets his brand new PF Flyers, and all his buddies are around him, and this thing is legendary, and they're freaking out like, oh my gosh, he's going to put his PF Flyers on, and he's going to go over there. So I imagine this as they see what's going on in the temple. Jesus leaves. He grabs some strips of leather. He's sitting there doing this. And now that we know that his disciples are mostly teenagers, you better believe these guys are standing around him going, uh-oh, uh-oh. Jesus is making a whip. Uh-oh, go get Andrew and John. Somebody get James. Jesus is making a whip. This thing's about to get real. And that's what happened. Jesus calculated move. He made a whip, went back in, and he drove out all the animals. He upturned the table. So Jesus got physical. I'm not calling for violence, but what I'm saying is Jesus was not passive. He actively opposed injustice. He actively opposed corruption. Okay? And the interesting thing about this is where he did it. He actively opposed corruption in his house, in his Father's house. So far we've got Jesus was meek. And we now know that meek was not weak. Meek was strength and control. Jesus was not a doormat. He was bold and righteously defiant, and he stood firm to expose injustice. We know that Jesus commanded his disciples to confront evil, to storm the gates of hell, and to minister in the heart of darkness. And then we know that he refused to allow corruption in his temple, in his house. He was consumed by zeal, so by desire, passion, and commitment. He had zeal for his house. And so I want to talk, it's interesting that Lex, what she had said before she sang, talking about marriages and families, and that was, we didn't talk about this. I'm actually going to use a little bit of one of her verses, but this is kind of where we are here. The primary battleground is going to be your family. And do you have zeal for your family? Are you consumed by it? And think about what the word consumed means. It's not like I have zeal. Consumed. Like if people ask, like, did you consume alcohol? Alcohol gets in your system and you get drunk. It changes your entire being. Consumed by zeal should change your entire being. This is where the fight should begin. We renew our mind, then we fight for our families. We fight corruption from the inside out. And this is not a passive process. Here, I know I'm going out of order, but now I want to do, does anybody have the memory verse? Judy. You want to say it? Sorry. Thank you, Judy. So what does it mean? What does it mean to provide for your household? You know, we think of this a lot of times, and I'm going to speak to guys a little bit here, that providing is making the money. It's part of it. You know, you need money to survive, but you also need to be present. So if you're not present, you're not providing. A lot of times I think we get confused. We think, you know, we want to give our kids all the things we didn't have growing up. You know, big house, toys, all the new Jordan colorways, all the opportunities to do things. You know, want to play sports at a high level, get, you know, maybe get private coaching, things like that. Still have time for video games. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. You know, it's not sinful to have nice things at all. Wealth is not a sin. And it's also not sinful to have kids who excel at what they do. But if this is your idea of what providing is, you have missed the mark. You know, if your child, you know, we're meant to set an example, and that's not always popular. So, like, what if one of your kids asks you to sign up for a sport that has games on Sundays during church? And you say, okay. What message are you sending? The church is priority unless something else comes up, unless something fun comes up. It's not always fun to be a provider. It's not always fun to have zeal for your family. With your kids, one thing to remember, you know, more is caught than taught. I think that's really important. I tell clients that sometimes. So more is caught than taught. It's what you're doing. What are you displaying? What are you teaching your kids in that sense? And it doesn't matter as much nearly what you're telling them. So are you using grown-up words that then you tell your kids not to say? What do you think your kids are going to do when you're not around? Is it common for you to get angry and say things you don't mean? Say, well, that wasn't me, that was the anger. Jesus says in Luke 6, for out of the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. So it's not the anger, it's you. You know, if filth is coming out, that means there's filth on the inside. And that's where renewing your mind comes in. We need to display and actively, remember, it's an active fight. We need to actively battle against the things. We're not fighting against flesh and blood. We're fighting against spirits. We're fighting against principalities. You know, do you know more about what a politician did this week than what your children did? Do you know more about the identity of the perpetrator of the most recent mass shooting or assassination than you know about who your kids are spending their time with, who their best friends are, their boyfriend or girlfriend? For dads, I think we've been misled by TV dads, the Tim Taylors, the Phil Dunphys, the Homer Simpsons. I think these are adult boys who play passive roles in their family. You know, your spouse is not your competition. It's not your opposition. Sometimes you have to have hard conversations. The thing about hard conversations is that they're hard. It's not fun, but you got to do it. You need to act as one. Whatever your mom thinks is never a good answer. It's just not. What that breeds resentment. If that's your, I know it's funny, that's a Tim Taylor response. If that's your answer and your wife's the bad guy, or vice versa, it could be the other way around, that breeds resentment, and that drives a wedge. That drives a wedge in your relationship. That drives a wedge in your family. If you don't know how your wife would respond, the good news is it's not a time test. You are in charge. You can say your mother and I will talk and we'll get back to you. You don't let you are in control. Don't let the logistics of your family turn you and your spouse into passing ships in the night. This is something I see in marriage counseling a lot, where it's, you know, people come in after kids are out of the house and they say, you know, we've last 15 years we've been running here and there, and really just, you know, we had to get our kids to all the events and make sure everything was okay, and we just grew apart. I'm changed, she's changed. I'm changed, he's changed. And we don't know who each other are anymore. So fight for your family. Be consumed with zeal for your house. And fight like Jesus. But the thing is, you can't You can't fight like Jesus if you don't know Jesus. So I want to take a minute and share the gospel. I noticed that Ed does this every week, and I think it's important because even if you never know who's going to be here or how many times somebody needs to hear it, but the gospel is that we are here on earth for a limited amount of time, and but this is not our home. We have an eternal home in heaven. And I want you to think about eternal. Eternal is eternal. Eternal is forever. Like forever, ever, ever. Like 18 trillion years isn't even 0.25% of what eternity is. So that is where our home is. And the only way to get into that home is that the creator of the universe came down to earth in human form as the man Jesus Christ, because this is a perfect place where we're going. We don't fit the bill. We can't make it, not a single one of us. And only perfection can get in. And that price had to be paid, and that's what Jesus Christ did. Jesus Christ paid that price. And it's up to us to put our faith and to believe. The word believe is pistuo. Pistuo is an active faith. So it means to believe with action. I'll give you an example. So I ride mountain bikes sometimes with Dave Strawn, and the first time I went out, he taught me how to go over. He was teaching me different areas, like how to go over this jump or this thing. And he would say, okay, get up to speed. You just have to be going fast enough and sit back on your bike and you'll be fine to go over this. And it sounded kind of scary, but I believed him. Not only did I just believe that what he was telling me was true, but I did it. And that's the difference. It's like, if I didn't actually do it, did I really believe it? And so this belief, this pistuo, this is a belief in action. If the praise team would want to come back up, I'm going to kind of close up here. So if anybody doesn't know Jesus, now's the time. And if you have questions, this is the other thing. If you have reservations or hesitations, if you have tough questions you want to ask those questions. The truth doesn't mind being questioned. I love this quote. The truth doesn't mind being questioned, but a lie hates to be challenged. You can ask these hard questions. Ed always says, call him any time of day if you want to talk about Jesus. And that man will do that. He really and truly will. You have plenty of people who will. So if there's anything, whether it be, how could a good God allow suffering in this world? How could a good God allow this tragedy to happen in my life? Or there's no way that this stuff that's in the Bible, did this stuff actually happen? Ask these questions. If you have any type of reservation, don't keep it silent. Start asking around. There's good answers. I'm a skeptic. I was very skeptical of everything. That's my testimony. And I needed to know, I was like, well, I don't think this is true scientifically, historically, archaeologically, all those kind of things. Well, you do a little bit of digging and you find out, nope, it actually is all true. And so like I said, don't hesitate to ask the tough questions. If you guys want to go ahead and sing. If anybody would like to come to the altar, please come to the altar. If you'd go ahead and stand.